Grandparents are so important to a child. It's often the still point of stability, particularly when a family is breaking up. And it's there's a connection, even if you've got an intact family. Grandparents really do allow children to have a different point of view. That's that elder point of view. Often children and grandparents have more in common, have less conflict between each other than children and their own parents, or indeed their parents and their grandparents. So I think it's really important for parents to be encouraging that connection, keep that relationship going, even after a divorce or a separation, when it's the other side, as it were, the other grandparents, that it needs to be facilitated. As a parent, you need to be the one working to make sure that that access is open, that connection keeps going. There are lots of ways of doing it. It doesn't just have to be face-to-face. It can be mobile phone calls, it can be texts, it can be emails. You'd be surprised how many grandparents and older people are extremely internet savvy and are quite capable of joining something like Facebook and communicating with their grandchildren in that way. It's an important thing to be encouraging and helping to actually happen. And even if you feel upset, even if you feel that perhaps your ex-partner is someone you don't want to have any connection with, don't feel that their parents are necessarily on their side and will be, sort of pushing their point of view. Most grandparents simply want to be in contact with their children, with their grandchildren. It is a fact nowadays that you can actually go to court to argue for access. So grandparents who are not in touch with their grandchildren can go through the courts to try and make an order. But it's always so much better to try and do this face-to-face, through a letter, through a phone call, before you actually even think of going to law. But I think that's the thing to do, that if you're the grandparent who doesn't have any contact, that's what you should be really saying to the parents of these children. This is not about you and me. This is not about me and my child, who you may be angry with. It's actually about me and my grandchildren, and how much grandchildren actually need that connection and really value it, and it is really good for them. In a lot of families, grandparents are there often as backups to parents. They care after school, they care for the grandchildren over weekends. But in quite a few families, of course, either formally or informally, grandparents have taken over full-time care of their grandchildren and sometimes feel rather unsupported. It all depends, obviously, on whether it's a formal arrangement or an informal arrangement, whether you can get financial support, but there is always emotional support. And certainly we talk to a lot of grandparents at Family Lives about this situation, and the Grandparents Association, and you can find the link to them through our website, are particularly expert in giving advice and giving support to grandparents in a role that is becoming perhaps more and more common. One of the big problems about either parents or grandparents feeling that they are physically or emotionally being abused by a child is the feeling of shame. Often parents feel so overwhelmed by fear, by the anxiety, by the violence that they may be directed towards them, either verbally or physically. And they feel that there is nowhere they can go because they feel they may be judged, or they feel they may even not be believed as to what is actually happening. I think the really important issue to stress is that you shouldn't allow this to go on. You do need to ask for help. If for no other reason than it doesn't do the child any favours to protect them. I think this is often a common feeling, that you're so afraid of, if you do complain, if you go to the police, if you go to social services, you're frightened that the child may get into trouble. And you keep hoping that actually you're wrong, it's not quite as bad as it thinks, it may get better. And of course what the child is getting as a message is that somehow it's allowable, it's acceptable, it's understandable what they're doing, and of course it isn't. They need, in fact, that boundary to be drawn and that no to be said and to be heard. So where do you go? If it is violence, yes, you can go to the police, and the police will understand, they will be supportive, they will be trying to mediate, to try and understand what's going on, rather than simply seeing it in terms of, this child needs to be taken away and punished. You can go to your GP. You could, of course, start off by going to Family Lives, and we'll talk through the problem and find out what's going on. Usually when there is either verbal or physical abuse happening from a child, there's a reason for it. They're angry about something, they're upset about something, something's happened in their life, and they're targeting you and they're kicking off at you to try and act out, as it were, their rage or their pain or their confusion. And often the best way of dealing with this, of course, is to shine a light on it, help that child express what's going on, find out what's going on, and support that child in working through. But staying silent, feeling that you've got to cope with this on your own because you're ashamed of it or frightened about it, as I said, doesn't help you, and it doesn't actually help the child. Well, how long's a piece of string? It obviously depends on the age of the child and the reason that the child is asking for this. If they're over 16, a child can choose where they live. In fact, if they're over 14, usually a child may be able to make choices, and the courts would not necessarily go against that, because an over 14-year-old at least has the right to be heard and listened to. But I don't think the courts are what we necessarily want to get involved in here. What you're wanting to know about is, should you be saying yes or should you be saying no? And it depends on what's going on. If that child at the time is unhappy, if there's something going on in their family of origin that they feel they want to get away from, do you want to support them in that? This is something perhaps you and the parents need to talk through. Because it may in fact be a situation where the parents or the parent may actually rather welcome that idea of respite, that idea of a support from you. It's not being seen or being put as a punishment, I'm taking the child away from you because you can't cope, but is being seen as, I'm wanting to help out and the child would like a bit of support in this way. Can we work it through together? It may actually be the best thing possible for everybody involved. It's something that needs to be discussed. But I think, the answer, strictly speaking, is that it does depend on what the age of the child is as to whether the child can choose to do that. And of course, you may actually, under certain circumstances, feel that it's the right thing to either go to social services or indeed the police to rescue a child if you think the circumstances are actually putting that child at risk. Often, parents look at their parents, the grandparents of their children, as being the obvious free childcare. After all, in a lot of cases, grandparents may be working part-time, maybe even retired. They're there, they love their children, they're a free resource. You have to think this through very carefully. Often, grandparents, people at that time of life, have their own things to do. They may still be working full-time, or they may be seeing this as an opportunity. This is a time in life where you have an opportunity to do all those things you've always wanted to do, spend that time and your money on pursuing interests that you have. And so sometimes you may not want to be at the beck and call or there every day for your grandchildren, however much you love them. So it's about sitting down and actually saying, this is what I'd like, this is what I need, this is the timetable that I would like, but mum or dad, mum and dad, how do you see it and what do you want to either give or take in this situation? Often, of course, grandparents is wonderful. You're being needed again, you're being wanted again, you're being able actually to use skills that you've got again, and you may adore spending time with your grandchildren. It makes you feel young again, it's fun. But I think it's quite important for grandparents to be able to say no, to recognise that this is something that is, in a sense, a gift, it's something that needs to be discussed, it needs to be negotiated, not something that needs to be assumed. Because when you assume responsibilities, when you assume that somebody else has got a responsibility to you, very rapidly it becomes a burden, and that's where you can get resentment and unhappiness, which simply doesn't work. So, talk it through, present, as it were, your request, listen to what the other half is saying with you, and work things out. It's always a good idea when you're thinking of childcare to have lots of different things in place, not just to have one set of people, one person whom you're assuming is going to back you up. You need lots of separate things in place just in case one of them falls down on that particular day.